Welcome to one of the most controversial podcasts I will give. In this podcast, I'd like to talk about the phenomenon of racism. I want to talk about how it started, what it is really, and what the resolution of this problem is truly going to be, or truly is. And when I'm talking about racism, I'm talking about anti-black racism. Because that is the only racism that exists. Don't let anybody fool you and tell you that, persons of color. I don't understand what that means. Persons of color. What is that even supposed to mean? There's only one racism in this world. There's only one thing that racism means. And racism is the dynamic of power. Now, normally human relationships have dynamics of power. The sharing, the interactivity between sentient beings is always flavored with some type of power dynamic, in the sense that the interactivity can never be 50-50. Now, in what distinguishes racism is that the dynamic, right, is primarily driven by the way that you look, skin color, black skin color. And most people have gone insane thinking about the phenomenon of racism. Most people have looked for answers in all sorts of places. They have gone to extremes to investigate this phenomenon, and there have been notables in this dilemma. But my two favorite notables are Dr. Francis Welsing in the US, who was a psychologist, who did some fantastic work in this field, because the phenomenon of racism is always looked upon with tinged and laced with so much emotion, especially if you have suffered the pains from this phenomenon. But Dr. Francis Welsing took a clinical look at the phenomenon of racism to try to understand what it is and to understand where it is coming from a clinical psychology point of view. Another notable is Dr. Marimba Ani, who was an anthropologist, was or is, I don't know if she's still alive, but she is the author of the book titled Yurugu, which is an African-centric view of European civilization. The way she described it is, prior to the writing of her book, she found so much literature regarding from a European perspective, analyzing Africa. She never found one that, for the converse. So she decided to take a look at European civilization from an African point of view, and then to critique it. So these are two powerful women that I respect a lot. I have read a lot of their work, and I can't stop praising their insiders. Powerful women with powerful insight who decided to look at the problem from an academic point of view, which is the same vantage point that I'm coming from. To look at it, to study it like a phenomenon, like you would study the phenomenon of the transmission of light or the propagation of light, or you would study the propagation of electromagnetic fields, or you would write the equations of heat transfer. These are physical phenomena. So these ladies looked at the phenomenon of racism from that point of view in order to delineate what its causal structure really is. And they made some interesting breakthroughs and insights. And that's what I want to talk about in this podcast. Now, my entry point into the discussion regarding racism is somewhat unusual, because in the end, racism, or the phenomenon of anti-black racism, you can simply describe it as the power dynamic from non-melanated people targeted against deeply melanated people. Okay? So it's literally a power dynamic, a tussle for power that is flowing in one direction from people who have very limited, almost to no melanin on their skin, meaning no dark pigment on their skin, to people who are heavily pigmented with a dark pigment melanin on their skin. That is what defines the power dynamic of anti-black racism. So it is essentially like a river that flows downhill, where the top of that river is the non-melanated peoples of the world, and at the bottom of that river is the deeply melanated people of the world. And everything in the world, every other experience, human experience of the world, has been laced with this phenomenon completely from start to finish. But my entry point into the discussion of this phenomenon comes from an observation. You see, this is a phenomenon that is being caused by 23.5 degrees axial tilt. Yes, exactly, that's what I said. The Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees, its axis, that is, meaning it is basically on its side. The axial diameter is not pointing upwards. It's tilted to the side, 23.5 degrees. And this is what is responsible for the seasons, because this tilt means that some parts of the globe, I'll call it a globe, but we must recognize that the Earth is oblate spheroidal, but I'll just call it a globe in this podcast. That should suffice. It simply means that all aspects of the globe do not receive equal amounts of sunlight. That's exactly what it means. So some parts along the tropical areas are closest to the sun. They are tilted more towards the sun. And some parts are tilted away from the sun. Now that difference in tilt, that's all that's responsible for the phenomenon called racism. That's really what it is. Now, in my podcast where I spoke about the ancient Nile civilization, I talked about how at some point in time, the ancient hominid that would become Homo sapiens, that will eventually become Homo sapiens, roamed the plains of Africa. Not a jungle, plains, savanna. And for some reason, this hominid became bipedal. It began to walk on 2 feet. Now, there are so many speculations out there as to why this bipedality occurred. Okay? But I'm not going to go into that now. I think there's a podcast I did for that. And at the same time that this bipedality was occurring, this hominid lost its fur. And this, for me, is the most significant transformation in the life of this hominid, the loss of fur. Because what it meant now was that the skin of the hominid was exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun without any protective covering. And so the earliest human hominids were not melanated on their skin. It's simple to examine. If you take any primate on Earth, maybe a chimpanzee or whatever, and you shave its fur completely, the skin is non-melanated. It's non-melanated. It's pale. It's like white, but it's not white, but it's pale. It's colored, but you can clearly see the blood flowing under the skin. And so, skin cannot be exposed to the sun's ultraviolet radiation like this. It would burn. It would become cancerous. It would become very uncomfortable for the hominid. And so what nature did was to pigment this hominid. And the pigmentation is really just a reaction with melanocytes in the dermis of the skin. They began to pigment. They began to produce a dark pigment, which most scientists today refer to as melanin. But it's really not. Because according to another revered, in the Black consciousness community, there's another revered speaker and author called Dr. Phil Valentine. Now, don't confuse this with the other talk show host, Phil Valentine. This is Dr. Phil Valentine. And he gave a, a podcast, or he produced a video called Melanosis and melananalysis. That's really what it is, melananalysis, where he talked about what the essence of melanin. Now, it's a 1.5 hour long video, but in summary, what he said was that melanin is not just a pigment on your skin. It's literally the biochemical signature of life. And this makes a whole lot of sense, because if you have been following my podcast where I talk about the 5 principles of organized complexity, and that the symbol for the 5 principles of the symbol for organized complexity itself is the number 6, and that 6 is not just a numerical representation. It actually means something in nature. It is a configuration. It is a configuration that represents a particular type of relational order, and that nature builds instances of this relational order, which it then uses to structure life and all other complex systems, or naturally occurring complex systems. And life is the most dynamic complex system that there is, because it is adaptable. Okay, and when you get to the human being, you have a bootstrapping of that adaptability in the form of the central nervous system that is self-aware. So that's really what it is. And so that 6 is essentially, in physical form, it is carbon. And carbon is black. Some people might say, oh, there's another allotrope of carbon that is diamond. Yeah, but diamond is simply carbon, the black suit of carbon, that has been placed under tremendous amount of pressure and heat for an extended period of time, which now transforms it into carbon. I mean, if you take a look at graphite or graphene, these are all related to carbon, and they're all black. And so melanin is not just the thing on the skin. It became the thing on the skin to protect the dermis of the early hominid from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And in the podcast, my podcast, the primordial black civilization, I talked about how this pigmentation of the skin was a symbiotic negotiation between the sun and the early hominid, and that this pigmentation allowed the hominid to recognize the influence of the sun. And since the sun is a central orb in the sky with a very predictable movement in the sky, this facilitated the emergence of a singular self-awareness, which we call I today. All of it came from this thing that we call melanin. Now, what I'm talking about here is basically just physics. I'm not talking about the superiority of melanin or otherwise, because that is not a discussion that I want to go into. I'm talking about what melanin is, where it came from, and why it exists. Now, in my conjecture, not every hominid had the potential or the ability to create the pigment to cover the skin. There were some genetic anomalies whereby the pigmentation did not form. And so some hominids died. And the ones that didn't die became so uncomfortable they had to move away from areas of very high UV intensity from the sun. And so they began to migrate. And so in the literature, there have been very many speculative reasons as to why the early hominids migrated from Africa. Well, my conjecture is based on what? Body temperature, skin temperature, humidity, comfort. I mean, it's the same reason why people migrate today, but in terms of comfortability, you're looking for the best way in which to, or the best place to be able to express their humanity and their potential. People are always looking for the best areas to live. So why should this be any different, even though this is occurring billions of years ago? or millions of years ago, rather. Now, these early hominids began to migrate out of the plains of Africa towards more temperate regions. And why stop there? They began to migrate to places where they became comfortable. This is in contrast to the generally accepted idea today that it hominids, black hominids, migrated to these areas where they lost their melanin, or pigmented hominids migrated to the temperate regions of the world, where, because of the low radiation intensity from the sun, began to lose their melanin so as to be able to synthesize vitamin D. Now, what I'm saying is there may have been a mixture of black or pigmented and non-pigmented hominids, but the primary driver is that some of these hominids were never pigmented in the first place. They could not develop the pigment. And so the only alternative for them in terms of survival was to migrate to the temperate regions of the world, seeking a more comfortable experience for themselves. And as nature does its thing, periodically the ice ages came, which further entrenched, they began to adapt to this very temperate environment. And look, listen, an ice age is not something that we can easily comprehend from today's reality, because when we think of ice ages, we think of a very bad winter, very cold, bad winter. But an ice age is usually something in the region between 10 to 25,000 years long of continuous winter, hard winter, where you have several miles, 20, 25, 30, 100-mile deep glaciers and snows. Now, I'm not sure of these figures, I'm just speculating, but that's really what it is. It's not something that we can easily imagine today. Nothing survives in that region. There's no food, no plants, no trees, no nothing. It's literally just frozen out. And so how does life survive in this? Because some life is able to hold out in that region, but because everyone knows that it's the power of the sun that basically allows for the diversification of life and the propensity of life to just multiply. Without the sun, this process is halted, and there is no diversification. Life is just hanging by a thread. And it is within this region that a group of hominids had to survive and ultimately thrive. What do you think they did? How do you think they lived? Now, I have just mentioned that the sun, I have just talked about the sun's role in the creation of the sense of self, which we call I. Well, in the absence of that sense of self, then astrologically, what this tells me is that the sense of I is delayed. The formation of the sense of I needs to be linked to something, but certainly not the sun. Now, in astrology, the sense of I is solar. But in the absence of the sense of I, the unconscious part of the psyche takes over, and that is primarily driven by the moon astrologically. And that signifies the being driven by instincts. And that's exactly what it is. In that kind of environment, the sense of self is not driven by the sun, it is driven by the moon. And the moon is extremely instinctual because it is primarily concerned with survival. And this is the basis upon which I will lay out this conversation that is anti-black racism. Where did it come from? What exactly is it? Because ultimately what I'm trying to do is to show you that, or to convince you that this phenomenon is simply our understanding of the axial tilt of the earth. And that we have now taken this axial tilt and given it superfluous meaning regarding the nature of survival and the nature of material resources. Because ultimately what I'm going to do is I'm going to define two strategies one primarily driven by the sun and the other primarily driven by the moon. And it's upon this that we're going to build what is called an Earth versus sky competitive strategy. Now, these two labels are very important. The Earth-based strategies and solar-based or sky-based strategies. Okay, here we go. On the plains of Africa, in those areas where life was abundant, the early hominid began to learn how to survive as a bipedal, as a furless animal with a burgeoning sense of self. And this sense of self was such a powerful emanation in that it helped the hominid to outcompete every other living thing on the plains of Africa. And so this early hominid formed an idea of what resources mean. Now, in the absence of seasonal cycles, the early hominid simply had to plan for living another day because the seasons were fairly constant and food, generally speaking, was abundant all year round. Now, contrast this to life in the frozen wastage of an ice age, a temperate region. Food was extremely scarce, and when it was found, it was defended, or I would say the competition for it was extremely fierce. Now, it is not too far-fetched to think that in the absence of relative abundance, these early hominids had to devolve into all sorts of manner of living for survival, which would also include cannibalism. Yes, absolutely. They would eat the dead and sometimes maybe even eat the living, just not to starve to death. They would come to regard the earth and nature as an extremely hostile place, one that is always trying to kill them, one in which they had to learn to survive by any means possible. Contrast this to the other extreme, where nature is seen as guile and wily, so you have to understand her, but is relatively benign and favorable because there is abundance, relatively speaking, that is. And you still have to understand nature, otherwise she'll kill you. But there was relative abundance. And nature was seen as something that could be entered into on a symbiotic level. And the time, this is the important thing, the time taken to enter or to foster such a relationship, such a beneficial relationship or mutually beneficial relationship with nature was way, way shorter than the time taken to forge that kind of relationship in the temperate regions. And this time, this measure of time, is very important because it now constitutes the essential ingredient in the development of the sense of I. Now, what happens to a human, for instance, today, when a human is properly fed, secure, in that the basic needs are met, which is food, security, and shelter. These are the basic human needs. Once these needs are met, then a human being begins to investigate its own internal nature. Who am I? What am I? Where did we come from? These are the big questions. And it is not far-fetched to go from that kind of thinking to what is the nature of the universe? Who is God? Or what is the nature of the oneness of everything? Who controls everything? Who's in charge of everything? Who built this place? And why does this place behave the way that it does? These are the huge questions, the big questions. And all these questions lead you to God. They lead to the existence of God. That's what they are there for. Because one of my podcasts, I came to the conclusion that the overriding aim of human life is the forging of the grandest of meanings. That's really what it is. A human being is a meaning-making machine. And what we're here to do is to forge the grandest of meanings in such a way that it is good. We're looking for the highest goodness possible. We're here to experience the highest goodness possible, to understand it and the why of it. That is the sum total of human experience. Now, you cannot, when you do not have the basic requirement for human living, which is food, security, and shelter, you cannot begin to ask the big questions. You're always trying to survive. You're always in a state where you are trying to survive. Because one wrong move and nature kills you off. That's really what it is. And so, on one part of the globe, the sense of I was able to develop to a very high level where civilization became possible. What is civilization? Civilization is the implementation of what? Of order. Relational order. All civilization is guided by mathematics. All. The establishment of basic principles regarding relational order. Numbers. All civilization. In fact, that is what is called civilization. Now, on the other side of the globe, in the temperate frozen regions, no civilization was possible. How? People are always on the level of survival, trying to survive. So the sense of I becomes stunted and underdeveloped. And the early human is driven primarily by instinct. The instinct to survive, the instinct to feed, the instinct to survive is one of the most powerful instincts. And it's also very sexual. Okay, so when civilization advances to a point where it becomes highly developed and highly sophisticated, it begins to tackle the big questions. It's not, this is what is called human programming. It's the psychology of a human being, to try to understand what it is and where it comes from, so as to understand how to be. So every civilization, once it reaches a sufficient level of sophistication, begins to tackle the big questions with a view to generating deeper and deeper insight. And this is what lifts the hominid up towards an exalted, godlike state. Okay? That's the way it's always been. Now, you can now contrast the dichotomy that exists between these two aspects of the globe, created by the loss of fur and the axial tilt of the earth. That's really what it is. Now, in a bid to develop, to enlarge, or as part of the process of the enlargement of the sense of I, which is civilization, the early deeply pigmented human beings began to travel around the earth. Because that's what people do, When their awareness begins to grow, they begin to explore. And so they began to explore, and they came across, these various regions which they avoided, because these are not places that people can live. Because they understood that once you live in this region, something is lost. And that's why it seems as if early civilizations had sun worship of some kind. It wasn't sun worship. Nobody was worshiping the sun. They were recognizing the sun as the driver of civilization. People do it today. The entire European civilization is built around the sun. It's just that people don't know because they call it Christianity. It makes no difference what you call it. You see? And so, eventually, after many, many, many years, what you can only term as geological time, there were so many pigmented civilizations, so many melanated civilizations. History has lost count. Every ancient tale you hear of, everything that has gone into myth, every story and narrative of so-called Atlantis, and every narrative you can think of that originates from the distant past, that has gone into myth and fables today, are all stories regarding the civilizations of pigmented people, deeply melanated people. That is really what it is. You see, the history of the world, the history of human civilization is so on this planet is so old. It's so old. There's no name for most of what it was. What we have today is the most recent iteration of what can only be described as collective amnesia. And that is what fuels racism. Now, at some point in time, I'm going to jump across a large expanse of time now. These deeply melanated people decided to create a showcase civilization, which today is referred to as the Nile Valley civilization. And in my podcast on the Nile Valley, I talked about how this civilization was not just, it wasn't, it was more like, it was like a trade fair. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of something, as like a showcase of all the civilizations as they were known at that time, brought together to a particular point, to a focus. And that the area of where this civilization was created was specially chosen to reflect some very deep understanding regarding the nature of who these people were. And so I surmise that they did this because they understood that the world was about to change. And when the world is about to change, and that change is going to affect you in such a way that it is inevitable, then the only sustainable strategy, or the only strategy that makes sense for survival, is to build an ark. And you find such stories, the building of arks and all that, they're common stories in myth. But these are deeply melanated stories. These are stories from the civilizations of deeply melanated people, their history, forgotten histories. And so the Nile Valley civilization is the creation of a showcase civilization, and then the creation of an ark. Now, you would say, but an ark is used to preserve. No, today the arks that are built today, in modern times, are used to preserve genetic material like seeds, DNA, and all that. In your biblical stories, you were told that the ark was used to preserve animals and plants and things like that, 2 by 2. That's a very interesting story because that's not what it means. It's all built around the narrative of the six, but I don't want to go into that now. But in the Nile Valley civilization, the ark that was built was used to preserve something even more subtle: consciousness. And what is the nature of consciousness? The reason why consciousness is valued is because of the knowledge that it holds. So it was the Nile Valley civilization and all the monuments built there are rituals used to preserve the civilizational awareness of those people. And it entombed them. It entombed that civilizational consciousness. It entombed it and set a clock for its re-emergence into the world. Because the world is about to go into a state that is akin to death. And so the symbolism of that new state was what was enacted as the entombment of that civilization. And those who survived would go into an entombed state. And what is being entombed is not the physical flesh. It's the awareness, it's consciousness, it's the mind, the sense of I. Because that sense of I, that's how you know who you are. It is such an important thing that without it, you really can't function in the world. You wouldn't know what to do or what to be. confused, in a fugue state of, and that's what was entombed in the Nile Valley civilization and maybe some other civilizations thereabouts. Now, when the process was complete, the Nile Valley civilization collapsed, and the collapse was as in the signs of the collapse were simple. The Greeks began to come into this Nile Valley civilization to learn. The collapse literally meant the throwing of the doors open to the whole world. Because make no mistake about it, the entire civilization, modern civilization as we understand it today, came from this ancient Nile Valley civilization. All aspects of it. You only need to be unaware for you not to know this. But the moment you begin to understand, to do the research, and to go deeply into this, it becomes apparently clear, very astoundingly clear, that you can trace all elements of this modern day civilization which we have today to the Nile Valley civilization thousands of years ago. And so, but the way the story is told today, if you take courses in history or anthropology, they would tell you that everything started with the Greeks. As if the Greeks suddenly and magically just, invented these things or whatever, Rather, no one would basically say that or no one would, easily tell you that all those things that the Greeks knew were hundreds and thousands of years in development in Africa, or whatever the land was called, the Black Land. I'm not going to call it Africa because Africa is a name that was created by the Romans. So I'm simply going to call it the Black Land because that is how the people refer to themselves. They refer to themselves as the Black people, the Black Land. Modern day Egyptologists will tell you that the Black Land simply refers to the dark silt carried by the Nile and deposited by the Nile once every year in Egypt. That's absolute nonsense. And it's all down to anti-Black racism, as I'm getting into slowly. When we talk about Europe being a white continent, we're not talking about the color of the snow on the Alps. We're talking about the fact that the people are predominantly and culturally of a white Caucasian culture and visual appearance. You see, but that's what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to paint the picture of how racism came to be in the world, anti-Black racism. Because if you do not understand the problem, you cannot see the solution. To understand the problem absolutely is to see the solution immediately. That's really what it is. The emergence or the introduction of this ancient Black knowledge and wisdom into the rest of the world began to push civilization out into the west of the world, predominantly into the northern hemisphere of the world. And all was fair and dandy because, everyone, for a very long time on this planet, blackness was seen as something very divine, almost akin to royalty. Most people find it very difficult to believe, but it is true. For the bulk of human history, let me put it that way, for the majority of human history, blackness was intuited and perceived as divine, as a very high stature or high standard. It's only within the last couple of, that all of that has been reversed in perception. Now we'll get to that because there's a reason for that. Now, the pressure, because civilization is a pressure of some kind. It's a pressure within the mind because it is the introduction of order into chaos. Order drives away chaos, basically. And, and when I mean chaos, I just mean imperceptible levels of order. Order that the human mind cannot really grapple with. Because the order that is being introduced is not the order out there. The order, first of all, starts within. It is the order of the human psyche. the sense of I that emerges comes out of a sense of order. Okay? Now, but something began to happen. And this is where I'm just going to go right into the transformation. Something began to happen when the Greeks first began to understand the wisdoms that were emerging out of black consciousness, or that had emerged out of black consciousness. They began to piece it together through their sojourns in the black land. But there was a crucial aspect that didn't make sense to them. And in my research, I have narrowed it down to one thing. The Greeks did not understand how one single thing can have an explosion of meaning, a variety of meaning. It just didn't make any sense. Because from their worldview, one thing meant one thing. But from the black consciousness worldview, one thing has a variety of meanings. In that each layer or each focal point of consciousness held a meaning for that one thing. And so the meaning of that thing was not really a thing that is out there, but is the relationship, the relational order between that thing and the nature of consciousness. The Greeks did not understand this. And so what they did was they scrubbed this black consciousness or black wisdom and scrubbed it down to what they regarded as the bare essentials, the objective part of the understanding. And thus, from this worldview was born the objective nature of the universe as a predominant or as a guiding principle, so to speak. From the moment this objective type of thinking emerged, because of its emphasis on the material senses, because remember, the objectivity is built around material evidence. What you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste. The first scientific experiments were based on this predominance on the physicality of evidence. And so this objective paradigm, basically, once it came into view, was seized upon because it seemed to have a very close affinity with the consciousness of the Greeks. Remember, the Greeks and the Europeans essentially are the lineage of those who lived in the temperate regions of the world, who could not pigment, who could not develop pigmentation on their skin, the dark pigmentation, melanin or carbon. They couldn't. And so that's their lineage. And in the environment that they grew up in, the environment that they were raised in, that immediate experience, that immediate material experience was very often the difference between life and death. And so it is not surprising that they focused immediately on this aspect of black consciousness. The rest was discarded because they couldn't understand it. They selected for what they could understand and what was useful to them. And this is what they used. And from all of that came what is today understood to be Eurocentric thinking. It is from Eurocentric thinking that the entire scientific enterprise and formalism was deduced. Because it's the formalism that seeks to delineate an objective reality, a reality that can be brought into permanent focus, and an objective reality that can be controlled. And this is also the conclusion that was drawn in Yurugu, the book written by Dr. Marimba Ani, one of the women I praised at the beginning of this podcast. she was able to delineate the nature of Eurocentric thinking around this objectification of reality, as contrast to the the black consciousness way of understanding reality, which is what you would call it's not even a spiritualization, because that word just came from objectivity. It's not a spirit, it's something else. I don't have a name for it, but it is a realization or a reality where a single thing does not have only one type of existence. It has as many existences as there are meaning making opportunities in your consciousness. And so the question is, what is the true nature of reality? Because there's only one reality. There's only one existence. Now, if you have been focusing on the Eurocentric way of understanding reality, then nothing competes with science, the scientific method. It's been so powerful in its ability to shape human experience, but it's also been very limiting, and I'm going to explain to you why. But first, I need to have a detour. I need to make a detour back down to 14th century Europe or thereabouts. I'm never fixated on these timelines. But somewhere along the line, I'm skipping what the Europeans call the Dark Ages and the presence of the black people on the European continent. Who some people call the Moors and all that. I'm skipping all of that because it is not necessary for this discussion, even though there is a lot of evidence for the settlement of heavily pigmented people in the European continent, in areas like Spain and Italy and all that, where they formed a sort of ruling class, because what they brought was civilization. They brought order into the chaos that was the Europe back then. But I'm going to skip all that. I'm going to go straight down to the 14th, 15th century. And I'm going to start with the animosities that existed between the monarchies of Europe, because that's where this tale really begins, at the 47th or 48th minute. The monarchies of Europe were at each other's throats. It's very strange because all the monarchies were sort of related to each other, because royalty marries into royalty. And the kings and queens and princesses and princes, they all married themselves. And yet they were at each other's throats, engaged in fierce competition. And because of this competitive behavior, they always needed resources. So as at the time when Queen Isabella of Spain commissioned her the explorers to go search for a new land, they were broke. All their resources were pledged to war efforts. They were broke. And so they began to search for new lands to colonize, new territories to acquire, basically, for resources. And thus begins the exploratory events that have led to where we are today, directly, not directly led to where we are today. Because these so-called new lands and to digress a bit, what had happened to, after the collapse of the black consciousness civilization, it went into disarray, because when something collapses, it just fragments into 1,000 pieces, scattered all over the place. Now, each piece is separated from every other piece. There is no coordinated effort. There is no unity. They are all lost, in a sense. And remember, in the rituals that were performed before the collapse of that civilization, what was entombed was black consciousness itself. All its acquired knowledge was entombed. Literally, to entomb something is to bury it. And the reason for the burial is because of the ritual dictated a reemergence, a resurrection of that consciousness. And you can decide to call the consciousness a spirit or whatever makes you comfortable. But I'm just going to keep to the term consciousness. The reemergence of that consciousness was baked into the ritual process itself. And the clock that was set was a clock that was set with the stars. It was set with because the Today when you want to tell the time, you tell the time by looking at your watch. But thousands of years ago, there was no watch. There were no watches. You see, there were not even mechanical watches. The only way to tell the time was by looking to the heavens. Okay, and the heavens are very, it depends on what you're really looking for, but there's some very accurate timepieces up there. Now, the precession of the Earth's axis, because remember, I told you I started this story with it's the story of the axial tilt of the Earth. That's really what it is. And so the time clock that was set with the precession of this axis. Because there's something about the long-term evolution of the behavior of the Earth that is not understood today, but was very much understood in antiquity. Why? Because today astrology is not considered a science. It is considered a pseudoscience. Because it has been entombed. But astrology is one of the oldest, most powerful sciences that the human mind was able to put together. And putting it together it didn't happen over, science today is just about 300-400 years old or 500 years old at the most. Astrology is hundreds of thousands of years old in human civilization. Why? Because, for instance, for you to understand, each precessionary equinox cycle is roughly 26,000 years, plus or minus a couple. So for you to understand that there is a cyclical event going on in terms of that there exists a cycle, you have to have a minimum of 2 cycles. And that's 52,000 years, plus or minus a few. For you to actually begin to attach meaning to cyclical patterns and events, especially as they apply to human nature and the evolution of human consciousness, you need a minimum of 3 cycles. That's 78,000 years minimum. That's how old these. Do you have any idea what human beings are capable of doing in 78,000 years? The modern sensibility cannot understand this, because when you mention that human beings have been civilizing for that long, they'll ask you, where's the technology? Where's the evidence? Where's the technology? As if technology, as it is known today, is the only trajectory for human thinking. It is not, and that's what I'm trying to tell you. The idea of technology, that aspect of technologizing, it comes from an understanding of the universe that is predicated on the delineation of an objective reality. And I'm telling you that the objectiveness of reality is not something that was common. It was known about, but it was looked upon as a very small aspect of human consciousness. Why would anybody want to objectify the universe? Because the objectification means restricting the universe, trapping it into a very tiny container and saying, okay, this is all that there is. But it's not the universe you're doing that to. You're doing that to human consciousness. And so the bulk of human consciousness, which is your own internal experience, is lost. So why would anybody want to do that? So nobody did. You will understand today that the only reason why people objectify the universe is because of power. And because of what? Not just power. The power that comes from the racial dynamic. The power to dominate with fear and terror. Which means that you must create weapons. And that is what drives technological thinking. It's not the betterment of any type of human experience. It is not. That is what has been sold today, but it is not. It has nothing to do with any of that. Okay? But let me not get ahead of myself. When the exploring European royalty or their chosen ones or their anointed ones reached other lands all across the world, they met various shades of deeply melanated people who had fallen into a primitive state of civilization because their consciousness has been entombed. What those primitive people did not know is that, because they can't know this until it is time for their consciousness to re-emerge. They cannot know this. The process of entombment means it is what is being entombed or what is being buried is the self-awareness itself as it is, how it once was, is buried in the ground. symbolically. And then at a time, it regrows, it re-emerges. And the time is dictated by the precession of the equinoxes. That's really what it is. And so the entire Nile Valley civilization is a ritual. Most people don't understand it, but that's what it is. It is a ritual. It's a ritual steeped in symbolism. It's a ritual that has within it the power of black consciousness itself, what it once was. And so, when civilization had come to the temperate regions of the world, and obviously because the ice ages had retreated and all that, you still had the seasons to deal with. And so the seasons were a constant reminder, the changing seasons, the 4 seasons were a constant reminder that nature is still trying to kill you if you don't prepare for her, if you don't, understand her to the point where if you don't subdue her, she'll kill you. She'll freeze you to death in the winter. 6 months out of every year, it's cold, really cold and frozen. And so the awareness that grew up or that was forged in those very temperate regions of the world during the ice ages was never lost because of that constant reminder. And that had now translated into an objectification of the universe. And it is this objectification that drove the emergence of European civilization. And the pinnacle of European civilization were the monarchies. And hence their desire to dominate each other meant that they were always squabbling and warring amongst themselves, which meant that they always needed resources. And so this immediately spurred the desire to go and explore other parts of the world. Because remember, as they warred with each other in their objectified universe, their consciousness began to grow. Because the war itself is a dynamic. It's just like it's a different type of dynamic. And so that necessitated the need to explore other regions of the world, commensurate with their growing consciousness. And what they found when they came across these regions, these other regions of the world, were a people in a very primitive and fallen state. And what do you think they did? They decimated them. Now, you cannot rob, kill, steal, and decimate a people. The human consciousness does just the soul, or whatever you want to call it, the meaning-making ability. Remember, Christianity was predominant in this age of Europe. Christianity, and I told you, Christianity is a solar religion. It's the religion of the sun. It is because the sun is soul, because it is the soul in a sense. The soul is the organizing principle for meaning-making in a human being. And Christianity is all about that soul. It's all about the resurrection of that soul from a fallen state. That's really what it is. The behavior of that soul in Christianity is akin to the rising and setting of the sun. Okay? On the movement of the sun through the 12 astrological zodiac signs or houses in a year. And then the precession of the equinox also has to do with the behavior of that, the backdrop of that sun on the spring equinox of every year. The zodiac sign that is on the backdrop of that sun, the rising sun on the spring equinox of every year. So you can understand how Christianity really isn't a religion. I don't even understand what people mean by religion these days. It's either it means something or it doesn't mean anything. And the way it is packaged, it really doesn't mean anything because nobody understands it. Most of the adherents of it don't even understand what they're adhering to. But in the dogmatic version of Christianity, let me put it that way, Europe was flooded with a dogmatic version of Christianity. And so the essence was on, preserving your soul. Now, you cannot preserve your soul when you go about killing people, stealing them, robbing them, people who've not done anything to you. So the alternative, in order to make sure that this process can continue, was to dehumanize these people, to take a good look at them and then to refer to them as non-human. And once you have classified them as ungodly, non-human beings, then you can do whatever you like with them. You can objectify them. And remember, objectification allows you to control whatever it is that you objectify without remorse. because it's so disconnected from you that you can do whatever you like to it. Okay? It's the same way our scientific experiments are done. We objectify the experimental process itself, such that we have removed or disconnected from what it is that we're trying to measure. Okay? What we're trying to do is to catch nature, in an objective state, and then to write down the laws by which it behaves, and so doing to be able to dominate nature, to subdue it. And so that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly what has been happening. What we call racism today started from this process, but it wasn't quite complete with this dehumanizing. The dehumanization, no. What we refer to today as the core of anti-black racism came or was solidified when these explorations discovered that the true origins of black people is that they are in a fallen state. They are in a state where they have achieved greatness in civilization. They have achieved, because, exploration, you're exploring the same world that these black people have been on for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So you're going to come across, everywhere you go, you come across some aspect of their civilization or some aspect of their realization. And this drove a different type of feeling, because the Europeans realized that they're so far behind in their thinking. Why? Because just because the people you're looking at today are in a state that seems very primitive, doesn't mean that you cannot, because you can clearly see the works of their hands. I know all attempts was made to shelter or to shield or to disconnect these people in a fallen state from the works of their hands. But even the liar knows the truth. In fact, the reason why the liar is lying is because he knows the truth. He just doesn't want to accept it. So a lie is really an acknowledgement of the truth. That's really what it is. It's just looking at the truth from the other side of not being able to accept it. And so that is where anti-black racism really began. The intrinsic desire to make sure that a future can be built, right, that completely negates these people, these black people, because they were looked upon as superior. Listen, for a really very long time in this world, blackness was looked upon as divine, as something very powerful, as something to be desired. And all those records, they didn't disappear. They all still exist. And so when these explorers began to connect, because remember, there's a point in European history that is called the Dark Ages, where history was lost, literally. Nobody really knows exactly the things that happened in the so-called Dark Ages. But a new type of thinking emerged, one that seemed to be disconnected from the past. And the difference is blackness. I think for some reason, the presence of black people as a royal class or a ruling class in Europe, I think it disquieted a lot of people. I'm not sure. I'm just speculating. I think it disquieted a lot of people. And so, human nature took over. And so what we call anti-black racism today is a global system designed to disempower all those of black ancestry. To disempower them because they're afraid of them. And not only are they afraid of them, because the dehumanization process of killing, stealing, genociding, these were atrocities that were done to a really defenseless and hapless people who were in a fallen state. Yeah, they're primitive and all that, but they weren't yours to kill and to decimate. But because remember, in order to safeguard the soul of Europeans as prescribed by Christianity at the time, it was okay to do this to these people because they were considered not non-human and they didn't have souls, or souls that were in a fallen state, or souls that were damned, or souls that were not saved, or something, some religious dogma behind this. And so ultimately, when people began to realize that these are not a primitive, these people are not they have a great history behind them. They have in fact, the majority of look at, because most of the people alive today don't understand, they don't know what these black civilizations were all about, because these people, these promulgators of racism, white supremacy, they have scoured the entire planet looking for every evidence or every artifact related to black consciousness civilization. They have taken it and they have buried it, hidden it away from the public eye, hidden it away from the public view. So that, I mean, the only reason why the pyramids are still, the monuments in the Nile Valley civilization are still standing is because they couldn't be moved. They're too massive. You think the people who built them didn't know what they were doing? They were too massive. If they were simple structures, they would have been moved away and hidden from view. That's what I'm trying to tell you. These Europeans, driven by their religious ideology and dogma, they scoured the entire planet looking for every evidence of a black civilization or black consciousness. And then they moved it and buried it, relocated it and buried it away from the public view. They're all in institutional and private collections all across the world. And why did they do that? Well, it's very simple. They became so frightened that these people that we are dehumanizing, these people that we are subjecting to these horrific conditions on the basis that they have no soul, what happens when the whole world begins to see who they really are, and then to understand that they actually have souls and they're actually elevated beings? Then what do we become? And so it became imperative that the truth must never come out. The truth must never be found out. And this was a global effort. Amidst all the squabblings of the monarchies and the European nations, these enterprises were launched. And they were very successful under the guise of colonialism and colonial this and colonial that, enslavement and all sorts of nonsense. Everything was stolen. The entire heritage and culture of the people, the entire stories, everything was stolen. This was the first globalization in the world. And it wasn't good for black people, deeply melanated people. I mean, I even heard some black people began to feel that, oh, maybe it is because black people drove these other people into the temperate ice age regions. Nonsense. Nothing could be further from the truth. What we are witnessing as anti-black racism is the clash of two types of ideologies. One that is earth-based and another that is sky-based or solar-based. It is the search for dominance, for power between these two competing strategies. Now there is a problem. And that is what is playing out today and will continue to play out into the future. Is that all earth-based strategies, they look like the earth. And what is it that you can say about the earth? You know, in this podcast, I have used the term globe for the earth, but I've also said that the earth is oblate spheroidal. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a globe is a very good approximation for the shape of the earth. And what is it about three-dimensional globes? The surface of three-dimensional globes. They're confined. They don't have limits, but they're confined. They're bound. Even though they have no limits, you can circle a globe an infinite number of times. But you'll always be confined to a particular space. So when you start out from one end, the chances that you come back to the same end, sort of, from a latitude and longitudinal perspective. In fact, the longitude and the latitude was basically just to to be able to navigate around this globe. That's really what it is. All Earth-based strategies are confined to repetition. They always come back to where they started. Doesn't matter. An Earth-based strategy is a strategy that is based upon the nature of limitation. Resources are limited points of view. So every competitive strategy for resource ultimately brings the competitor back to where they started. It's a rule that is as definite as saying that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It is the nature of the globe. And all humans were born on this globe. So the globe is not really outside of us. We are the globe. It's in our thinking. It's the nature of our consciousness in a sense. But it is not all that we are. Civilization and the development of self-awareness means that upon that globe is built another type of awareness, which is the solar mind, that looks at the sky, that searches for its answers in the sky. That's really what it is. You see? And that's one of the things that Christianity tells you, essentially. Because if you look at the tenets, the basic principles of Christianity, they're so lofty and so they do not reconcile to earth-based strategies. And yet within the European mindset, you have both. The center for Christianity on the planet is in Rome. That's as European as it gets. But Europe as a whole has pursued earth-based strategies. And anti-black racism is an earth-based strategy. Because it's a strategy that is linked to physical objectives, tangible physical objectives, tied around the acquisition of material resources. And what I'm saying is that because of the nature of strategies that are involved in the development of this trajectory, it always comes back to a starting point. So at the end of the day, all earth-based strategies come to the conclusion that they are just not worth it. All. Because you just come back to where you started, just at a different point in time. And so that has always been one of the dominant fears of those who push anti-black racism as a strategy. Now, in the early days of this strategy, it was so obvious. I mean, the wickedness, the cruelty, everything was so open. Now, as we have moved towards the modern day 21st century kind of consciousness, all that has happened is human consciousness has begun to grow to the point where it has begun to examine certain aspects of itself in the light of itself. And one of the things that has also helped in that is the development of the objectification of reality. Now, because you have to understand the transformations that have occurred within that objectification of reality. Now, the vehicle for the objectification of reality is what we call the scientific method today. Now, but during the early 20th century, certain aspects of the scientific method began to... Remember, after Isaac Newton's Principia and the years that followed in classical mechanics, Europeans largely believed that the world was the entire universe, human experience was totally understood. If you know where everything is, you know the rules of motion and the laws of motion, then you can calculate the trajectory of everything into the future. You can predict the future with this 100% accuracy. That's the pinnacle of classical thinking. But in the early 20th century, cracks began to show in this kind of thinking. And the cracks started coming from the behavior of light. Something did not add up. The experimental evidence and the theory did not add up. Something was amiss. So scientists, European scientists, began to think of new ways in which the universe might be to match the experimental evidence that they were accumulating. And all of that necessitated a change in thinking. That change in thinking is what we call quantum physics today, quantum mechanics. Now, quantum mechanics, what it really is a boundary between two modes of being, the earth-based and the sky-based, or the solar-based, the limited form and the unlimited form. It is the process of transitioning human consciousness into something what it truly is. But most people won't see it like that because they don't have the context and the history that I'm providing here. You know, and that's another thing. The instrument, remember, the scientific method was built or was conceived of as a way to delineate aspects of reality such that they can be captured perfectly, which is what the Greeks felt was necessary when they came into contact with black consciousness civilization and knowledge. They rejected it, they couldn't understand. I mean, how can one thing have so many diverse meanings? You know, that you become lost. You don't know how to navigate. But if one thing can be attached to one thing, then it becomes a tool. You can use it, you can define it, and then you can apply it as technology. That's really what it is. That's the difference. Now, what quantum physics is saying today is taking us back to the original, because there is only one reality. There is only one truth. There is only one universe per se. There is only one consciousness that we are. And it is not dependent on the stories that we tell ourselves. If we tell ourselves the wrong stories, we come to the wrong conclusions. If we tell ourselves the right stories, then we are on the right trajectories towards understanding the universe in symbiosis with it and elevating our consciousness towards a type of godlike state where we become one with the creator of all things. And what does that look like? It means that our will becomes done. You see? You might think that's what's happening today, but it is not. You see, because we have reached the limit of the earth-based type of thinking. If we push it any further from where it is today, the entire human civilization, the entire human world would die. Now the world would be okay because it would just simply go on, but human civilization as it is would totally crumble and collapse. And billions of people will die. But to change human civilization as it is right now is to abandon the earth-based type of thinking, the limited form of thinking that has plotted the trajectory that everybody currently is on. That is to re-engineer the nature of science. Yes, to re-engineer the nature of physics. Now, it is going to happen whether we want to or not, because there is only one truth. And as long as you're looking for that truth, that is the truth that you're going to come to. And what is that truth? It is the truth of the nature of what? Blackness. 6. That's it. And this is what is signified by the re-emergence of the Kemp Nu, the ancient black consciousness that was entombed, buried, for a re-emergence at a later time. What do you think that re-emergence is? It is the re-emergence of truth. And in the face of truth, nothing can stand, nothing. And that coincides with the fact that all those deeply melanated people that somehow have this signature of blackness within them. I mean, it's not a given right or whatever, because the blackness really is not just a skin pigment or color. It is a consciousness. And it is not all black consciousness that was brought to the ancient Nile Valley. Not all, just the important parts. For instance, if you're going to hold a symposium on a unified field theory today, you're not going to call everybody that works in every field of knowledge. Just the important parts, those parts that you can use to assemble on a very high level the essential meaning of what a unified field theory is supposed to be. And so what does that imply in reality? What you are going to witness and what the entire world is going to witness is a major, major reawakening of blackness. Not all black people, because some black people, just because your skin is black doesn't mean that this thing applies to you. It's a consciousness thing. And just because you're not melanated on your skin doesn't mean that you cannot participate in this. That's not how it works. It's a consciousness thing. It's a knowledge thing, meaning it's an awareness thing. It's a thing that is related to your sense of I. And it is going to awaken all over the world. It has already begun and it's been happening for a pretty long time now. Maybe you can, based on this podcast, you can go and trace the emergence. It is the reacquisition of a certain type of knowing that fills the soul in such a way that we begin to do away with the majority of what we think today and what we do today. And the first thing that needs to be done away with is what is called anti-black racism, white supremacy. It is the killer of this world, the killer of this planet. And you will hear all sorts of, how did I get into this? Now, in 2009, I joined a company called Elizabeth Arden International as an operations finance manager, wherein which my role was to basically grab a hold of operations finance in such a way that I can stop the slide of gross margin. The slide that has been happening for many years. At least that was the way I interpreted my role. The company gross margins have been sliding for many years. And we all know that for margins to slide, it's one of two things. It's either top level or bottom level. Top level in that sales are dwindling. Bottom level is that costs are rising. And so my remit was from the cost side. I had no input into the sales side. And costs are basically related to process inefficiencies. Your costs rise when your processes are inefficient, or when you're not applying best practice. And so I set about correcting these inefficiencies. And in the process of doing so, I came across a stone wall of white supremacy. I'm talking about white men and women who basically just became so mad, so angry, that I was doing my job. I don't know if they actually expected the role to succeed, because the previous 3 people who had occupied the role did not succeed. So obviously they just thought, okay, another placeholder. But I'm not a placeholder. I succeed. That's what I do. I do things because I want to succeed. And I take a lot of joy and pride in my work. And so I set about succeeding. And I met my introduction to white supremacy. Prior to that, I had only had glimpses of this experience and discarded it completely, because I said to myself that my experience of life is only dependent on my ability to create that experience for myself. It's not dependent on what anybody else thinks. I'm in charge of my reality. But I met white supremacy in the form of white men and women who basically said, no matter how much you work, no matter what your input is, you will not be successful. Simply because we'll just deny that you're successful. So we're going to ignore the results of your success. We're going to ignore the fact that the gross margin is no longer slipping. We're going to ignore the fact that the operation of efficiency has increased. We're going to ignore all of that and just decide amongst ourselves that you are unsuccessful. And we're going to judge you as such. And so this was very confusing for me. And so I put the evidence of success in black and white on the table. And it was agreed upon that these were actual successes. So why doesn't that translate to a success for me? That was when I was told that it was because of my behavior. And for me, that was the final, that was the dropping of the shoe. Everything clicked. Because if you have the power to police my behavior and call it whatever you want, whatever you deem like, whatever you care for, and then to appropriate a response based on whatever stories you are telling yourself, whether they're true or not, then that is too much power. Where does that power come from? That's when I began to investigate the nature of white supremacy. Oh, in addition, I quit from the organization because I can't work with liars and cheats. I just can't, There's no pride because I take pride from my work. And part of the nature of that pride is integrity. I can't stoop to those kind of things. If that's what they call being a team player, I said, I'm not interested. There's no part of team playership where I am, my hard work, very hard work over a 2-year period is literally just a set of lies are crafted around it. For me, that's just nonsense. That's when I began to understand that this world is not just, because people talk about capitalism, capital interests and all that. That's nonsense. The world does not follow capitalism. The world follows anti-black racism. The global politics, the global economics, global everything from religion, every aspect of human experience has been structured according to anti-black racism to support white supremacy. The verdict is already in. It's a 10-year study for me before I close the book on that. I looked for every possible way in which I could be wrong. I did not find any. I investigated all aspects of human experience. And then I reached my verdict. And then I understood why the necessity of why the world needs to change. It needs to change because if it doesn't change, this craziness is going to kill everybody. And the human life and human experience, the human experiment as a whole is too important to the creator of this universe. It's not random. It's not just here because some accidents happen. It's too important. And it's gone on long enough with the madness. So it has to change. And so what we're going to witness is the re-emergence of black consciousness all across the globe. Unstoppable. Uncontrollable. As a means of saving the entire world. Because if you think about it, black consciousness has always saved this world from itself. Because the craziness, that is the cruelty, the savagery of these earth-based strategies, without black consciousness, they would have destroyed. Remember, Europe almost destroyed the world twice. The first and the second time, they didn't have the means to be able to do this. But with the introduction of the nuclear atomic bomb by the United States, which is just an extension of Europe, what you have is the ability to destroy human life on this planet, or human civilization on this planet. And once that threshold was reached, the die was cast. You cannot be allowed to do this. And your squabbling madness, the squabbling back and forth and all the whatever, this fight for dominance and supremacy, will end the entire human experiment if something is not done. And so the Creator has launched a process. And this is in timing. This is also in timing with the re-emergence of the Camp Nou. The Camp Nou are the people I call the original African, what we call African, but the original black conscious civilization. That is the Nile Valley civilization. Now I told you, I said, the Nile Valley civilization doesn't mean that every black person came from the Nile Valley. No. The Nile Valley was literally unoccupied for most of human history. Yes. People began to pour into this area when the end had come. That the time had come to showcase all that black civilization had come to be, and then to create the ritual and the process of entombing it so that it can re-emerge across the many waters. The many waters is time. Not time capsules. You know how people build a spacecraft to go to the farthest reaches of space to explore? These people built a time capsule to go to the farthest reaches of time and then to re-emerge as individuals, consciousnesses, individuals carrying different parts of this consciousness. Okay? What's the difference? When you investigate it, the thinking is the same. It's like going to a different star, but it's not just a different star. You're going to the same Earth, but thousands of years into the future. And for you to be able to do that, you need to navigate and target. Otherwise, you miss the location or you miss the time. So these structures were built in such a way that they're simply quite immovable. They were built to withstand tremors and all sorts of things, to make them immovable because they are targeting a very specific point in time. I mean, this is science that we don't, we talk about how advanced we are today in our scientific thinking. You understand? It's nothing. Because I can tell you today, the nature of dynamism that we can predict today, we can predict weather 2 weeks in advance. Beyond 2 weeks, then the predictions become nonsensical. I'm talking about predicting the nature of the environment of human consciousness and Earth thousands and thousands of years into the future. You have any idea what we're talking about? It's beyond belief. That's something beyond beyond whatever it is that is understood today. Might as well be alien. And these things were built with stone. Do you know why? I'll tell you why. If you watch this program called Ancient Aliens, you always hear about how aliens came and built all these monuments in the past. And it often makes me laugh because why would a star-faring civilization come all the way, travel across oceans of space and time to come build things with rocks, primitive-looking things with stones and rocks? No, they were built by human beings with just a different type of mind, a different perspective on the universe. Why did they build with stone? Because that's what you need to build with without causing any turbulence. Anything that, because what is the nature of creation? The nature of creation is such that when you create something, you have to assess whether it is good or not. Because if you create something that is bad, then you're only affecting yourself. You're not affecting anybody else. So when you create something, the creation is assessed based on what? Whether it is good or bad. And the goodness and the badness is tightly related to the motive that brought it into being. When these structures were conceived upon, they were conceived upon in stone. Because what's the worst that can happen with stone? Every technology you build today with metals, with things, and all sorts of combinations of alloys, they all have so many side effects that initially we experience a technological advantage, a boost. People are living longer, but it all crescendos after a while. Because most of what we have been doing, there's not been enough time for the consequences to play out. Stones have no consequences. Rocks have no consequence. Everything was made of stone. From the plate to the spoon to the everything, chairs, everything, stone. And so these people became adepts at carving stone, at working stone. It's really what it is. Stones hold no consequences for the planet. No environmental damage, no pollution, no nothing. None of these things. Okay? That's really what it is. Now, I have skipped through a lot, really, just to be able to get to this point of the story. But I'm going to make a slight detour back now because the importance of this podcast to everyone who's listening is how does this help us understand where we are today and what we need to do. Since my own introduction to the violence that has been enacted against black people, I began to explore this in detail because I needed to understand it. And when I closed the book on this, my understanding was complete. Now, people would say that because they would look at the current state of black people and say, but black people are primitive. They don't seem to have any science and tech. They don't seem to be able to have any development to speak of. Their history doesn't really contain anything significant. Today, they can't even organize themselves or govern themselves and all that. To those people, I have one thing to say, and only one thing, and they better listen very attentively. For the last 500 years or longer, there is no time at which white supremacy has left blackness alone. Not a single time. Not once. Okay? Since European explorers began to discover black consciousness all across the planet, they set about the systematic extermination of them all. And this extermination did not just come because, no, it came to exterminate in terms of the extermination of the physical bodies and the theft of the land, the renaming of the land and the theft of it. Places as far away as Australia, as far away as the northeastern part of Africa, what you call Africa today, the Black Land. Places as far as the Americas, both North and South America. These were all populated by people of deep melanation. They've all been wiped off. And when they were successfully wiped off from all these lands, I'm talking of genocide. When I say wipe off, I'm talking of the largest genocide ever committed on this planet. What the instrument of genocide is terror, terrorism, and warfare. When this was successful all across the world, then the hinterland, the black land itself, the core of blackness itself was attacked by what you call colonialism or whatever. That's just a fanciful way of saying genocide. And then the people, the hinterland was attacked so much that, millions and millions and millions of people were stolen from that land. Now you hear all sorts of talk about how primitive black people sold their own, and well, there may have been instances of that, because where there's a market, people are always looking. Greed is not something that is unique to a particular group of people. Greed is an aspect of human behavior that emerges when survival is threatened. All humans. Now, the difference between these two extremes of behaviors that I told you is the time it takes to satisfy the basic needs of food, security, and shelter. Because if this is done early, then the human is relieved from these burdens and begins to contemplate the greater mysteries. But when the human is stuck within these burdens, they cannot begin to contemplate the higher mysteries. So they cannot develop internally, psychologically. Their sense of self, the sense of I, remains very limited. And this is exactly what was applied to the hinterland. Because remember, after the black civilization fell, black consciousness civilization. Now, when I say black consciousness civilization, I don't mean that there was an overarching black civilization covering the entire black land. No. What I mean is the overall knowing of black. There's something called a collective consciousness. It doesn't matter whether the people are aware of it or not, but it's the collective consciousness because it shows the interlinkages and interrelationships between the various cultures as they exist and how they can be extrapolated as one. Okay, because cultures that coexist together have similarities between them. You really, wherever you have hard breaking cultures, that's referred to as a cultural fault line, and it's usually a place of extremely great conflict. So after this black consciousness civilization fell and fragmented into many pieces, they were attacked by these explorers who came into the black land looking for new avenues for wealth, and they were decimated. That's just a summary of it all. In terms of the civilization was scattered asunder. People were stolen and shipped off to faraway land, basically just scattered all over the planet, and the something called the Arab slave trade took place prior to this and was very extensive and very vast. You don't really find much information on this in the literature, but it is there. It was earlier and more devastating than the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, it's almost in comparison. You could say that twice as many black people were enslaved and shipped away during the Arab slave trade than the transatlantic slave trade. Now, why did this happen? Why did this happen? It's because the collective knowing and the collective mind of black consciousness has been removed and entombed. It's been buried as part of the ritual that was enacted thousands of years ago. So what does it look like when this entombment, when resurrection takes place? Well, the process of resurrection is captured in the narrative of Usa, Uset, and Heru. So if you know about that, what the Greeks eventually called Osiris, Isis, and Horus, there were no such things. There were no such people. It's a narrative that came from black understanding, black consciousness science. Okay? And I've told you what typifies black consciousness science is how one thing can have an extremely wide variety of meaning. And what typifies European science is how one thing has only one meaning, and that's it. So which of these is the true nature of the universe? And my answer is simply both. The objective aspect of the universe is real, but is also a very small aspect of what the universe is. It's a small aspect of what human consciousness is. The bulk of human consciousness is like the other side, which is one thing becoming many things, and many things becoming one thing. See, it is a subjective experience of being. In science today, it is referred to as dark matter and dark energy, simply because it's not because it is dark or black in color. It's because no one understands what it is. The darkness is referred to as a state of ignorance, so you can call it ignorant matter and ignorant energy. But it is not matter and energy that's out there in the first place. It is a sense of being. It's awareness. It's human experience that is missing. And so when these people came into this black land, they decimated them. They colonized them. They imposed on them systems of government, systems of all sorts of things, all based on the maxim that they are superior in terms of their understanding, in terms of their religiousness, their religious dogma, in terms of their understanding of reality and of life. And so anything that didn't conform to this was determined to be dark and taboo and destroyed. And that process continues till today because if you look at the black land today, the entire continent of the black land, it has been partitioned and divided into administrative units. That's what I call them. But it is not the administrative units for Africans or for black people. It's the administrative units for colonials, the people who forged these administrative units in the first place. And the units were simply carved to ensure the continuous free flow of raw material resources, which was the original intent of the explorers that arrived. They came looking for wealth because they were broke. And that wealth wasn't going to be handed over to them. So they came with guns and soldiers and appropriated all that wealth for themselves. And they used that wealth in the past and current day to build their own civilization. But the problem with that process is that it is an earth-based strategy. And all earth-based strategies come back to their starting points after a time. No advantage to be gained. Just time wasted and lost. And since time has been financialized, then all that has been lost, all that will be lost is a humongous amount of financial wealth. That's really what it is. It is inevitable. That's what I'm here to tell you. Inevitable. Because it is the nature of those type of strategies. So you say, if not these, one of the things that keeps people trapped in this type of living and this type of thinking is that they do not know They cannot envisage any other possibility of being, or way of being, outside of what is currently known. Well, that is not surprising. Human experience is like a container that is filled up with something. And when something is filled up inside it, it is hard to see how that container can be empty or how something else can fill it. But if you go back a couple of thousand years in history, you would find a very different type of consciousness, unlike anything that you have ever known. A different type of beingness, where everything also made sense. And people could function, they could live, they could go about their business with a sense of meaning. Now, science tells us today that it is the search for truth and all that. And I've said repeatedly, science is not the search for truth. It is the search for an objective reality that doesn't have any, that really does not have, cannot declare itself as truth, because that objective reality is also tainted. Why? Because before science is the search for truth, it is also the search for what? For human motivations, careers, money, finance, weapons, domination, the ability to control. So what is true about all of this? What is the absolute truth of any of this? Nothing. You see, we're all sold that the way that the world is the only way that it can be. In fact, you have a lot of, the general mantra is that the world is only a couple of thousand years old, and all that, people have begun to interpret their Bibles and their Qurans as literal history. This is madness. The last couple of thousand years of this world, in terms of human experience, sapient experience, is nothing but what? 5% of the totality of human experience. All the myths and the fables, where do you think they come from? Yet people dig up dinosaur bones every day. They dig up evidence that there was once a race of great lizards on this planet, and yet people hold the belief that human experience started from 6,000 years ago or something like that. It's beyond belief. I don't know how you reconcile these two things within a single mind of a human being. And some of these people are scientists who search for truth. That's because they've taken everything literally. The whole idea is that one thing means so many things, and if you cannot understand what that is, then you cannot understand anything regarding the truth of this world or the realization of this world. See? Astrology is now considered a pseudoscience because the Western astrology is just, I'm even of the conviction that Western astrology is just a small part of the overall what astrology is meant, because astrology is meant to be something that is, no primitive mind could have developed astrology as a thought pattern, as a causal pattern for human experience. No primitive mind. Because if you really consider what astrology means, what it's trying to say, it's beyond belief. You tell me that planets moving in the heavens, constellations in the background, all affecting human behavior, or even sometimes prescribing human behavior. It's beyond belief. What is the mechanism? We cannot see that mechanism from the things that we understand today, the objectification of the universe, because our internal experience is not studied. Our internal experience, the only thing that is studied is what can be measured. Tell me, where would I go in your brain to measure you as a sense of you, to understand the richness of your experience, how things look differently for you as compared to other people? Where do I get that information from in my measurement analysis of your brain? How do I come to the conclusion that the meaning that you forge is so internal to you, it's so unique to you? Nothing else in this universe will ever have that same perspective. Where do I get that from? So these are dilemmas and dichotomies, or these are problems that science just the way science is understood today is just shoved under the ground. Now, science is not just what we can measure. There is a science of things that cannot be measured, but can be understood. There is a science of human experience, human consciousness, and it is upon that science that the ancient black consciousness, the Kemp Nu, were able to forge a trajectory across the vastness of time. If there were no science of consciousness, the internal nature of consciousness in terms of the universe, then such a feat will be impossible. But it is possible, and it will unfold in front of our eyes in our modern day reality. It will unfold because we will see exactly how this transformation occurs. We're already in it. Just that most people haven't figured it out yet. We're already in it. Now, in terms of how people think that, oh, see, the black people across the world today are all enslaved. They are enslaved because they do not have their minds, access to their minds. Now, in every human population diverse, you will have deviants. You will have people who are just cruel. You'd have people who are all sorts of people. You have distributions like that in any population. Now, but what a civilization does, it encourages the aspects of self that it wants, that is beneficial to it, and it suppresses the other aspects. Now, the way that is done today is that rules and laws are made that are enacted or enforced by agents of those rules. You see, and some people think that this is the only way that civilization can be. It is not true. It is the only way it can be based on the paradigm that currently runs, the operating system that currently runs in every human being's head. But when you understand the nature of that operating system, and then you understand how flawed it is, and you discard it, and you replace it with a different type of operating system, then you don't have any jails anymore. You don't have polices. You don't have courts. Because you don't need them. Will people still have private ownership? Well, you'll still own your own experiences, if that's what you're asking. Nobody will tell you what to do. You are free to do what you want, but you will choose to do what is in the best interest of everybody else. Because you will not see any difference per se between yourself and everybody else. You are them, they are you. It's a different type of experience. It's not the experience that we have today. You don't have any successful black African countries or nations today in the world. None. No, there's no, I mean, the world economics have, geopoliticians have grouped the world into first world, second world, third world. How convenient. All the first world countries, the majority of them are all white countries, European countries plus their descendants. The third world countries, the so-called third world countries, are really just like shitholes, but they are, the bulk of them are the dark-skinned countries of the world. Now, this is not a coincidence. This is an engineered reality. And it has been engineered by white supremacy for the same reason that it has been engineering it for 500 years. It is afraid. It's simply afraid because it has done the wrong thing. It has gone on the wrong path. And those who the Creator is not with, will always have fear in them, fear in their hearts. That is the nature of that thing, the nature of human psychology. You know that what you have done is wrong. You don't need anybody to tell you. You might decide that, you might declare that, but the only reason why you institute a surrogate reality is because you know that it is false. The only reason why you tell a lie is because you know what the truth is. Your lie is admission that truth exists, that you cannot accept it. White supremacy is a lie. And so it has gone to every extreme, including the setting up of nations that are designed to fail. Take a typical nation like Nigeria, for instance. It's a country that was forged by the British. The liberation of the so-called independence of that country from colonialism needed to survive a vote in the British Parliament. Tell me, what type of freedom for a people survives a vote from their captors? What type of freedom is that? That is not freedom. Several votes, several bills declaring the freedom of the independence of this country, Nigeria, were turned down in the British Parliament. They failed to pass. Tell me, do you know what Parliament does? In the system of democracy, whether it's a parliamentary system or whether it's a congressional system like you have in the US, they are there for their own self-interest. So each person from each region the representatives are basically regional representatives protecting the interests of whatever region they represent. So all the regions in what you have called the British or the United Kingdom, whichever one you choose to designate it, all their interests needed to be satisfied. A compromise needed to be reached for all their interests to be satisfied before the people, the black people contained within this geographical expression nicknamed Nigeria, can be true, can be free to express their own God-given identity. What type of freedom is that? 60 years from then, from this act, and the people, they can't find any workable system for themselves. So they are still stuck on in the areas where they are constantly looking for food, security, and shelter. And so the people cannot develop to a point where they can begin to ask the big questions and to understand themselves and to, ask questions of the universe, to develop their own science and technology or whatever it is that they want to develop, to aspire to greatness. They can't. And the same thing is common for all the partitions, all the so-called enclaves in the so-called Black Land, Africa. All of them were partitions by European colonialists, designed under the same blueprint, that designed in such a way that they will never go anywhere. They will never achieve anything. And the reason for this is very simple, because a great number of these black people were enslaved and trapped in North America, the United States, and they were not given freedom. The desire was never there to grant them freedom. They were meant to be perpetual slaves. That if you understand human consciousness, you understand that such a thing is impossible. And so gradually they have tried to come out of those shackles. But it has been a long, drawn-out process. It's been hundreds of years, 400 years at least. And they're still not out of it completely. Now, if there were any other group of, you have also a large population of black people in Brazil and in the Caribbean. These are all places where ex-slaves were dumped after the colonialists decided that they were no longer going to operate a physical bondage system. It doesn't mean that they were not going to operate slavery anymore. They were just not going to operate a physical bondage system because there was no way they could now justify the physical bondage of other human beings. There was no story, no other lie they could tell that could cover that up. So they decided to remove the physical shackles, but not until new forms of shackles were implemented. So it's like a relay race, a handover system. Some people talk about, people are always blaming other people for their fortunes. It's not true. There is no other group of people in this world that have gone through what these black indigenous people, black African consciousness have gone through. No other group of people. None other on this planet. This is unique. And if they hadn't gone through that, the entire world would have been destroyed by now. Because the Europeans, the white people, they would have attacked themselves in the most vicious ways possible because of this viciousness, this cruelty that was forged by an environment that is very cruel. In order to satisfy that, to temper that cruelty, to calm those restless waters, something else needed to absorb that cruelty, the bulk of it. That's what the role that the black consciousness people of this world have played. They have absorbed on a global scale the cruelty of these people. Essentially, they have absorbed the cruelty of the entire environment. The environment that nurtured these people, the inhospitable environment. They have absorbed it. So some people think that, because the reason why these African, they call them African today, but I want to keep calling them black people. That Africa that name actually has been so bastardized and filled with shame and inferiority and all sorts of nonsense, all manufactured. The reason why none of those colonial nations were ever designed for success is because when you have successful black nations, then the black nation that is trapped within North America because it was enslaved, begins to ask questions about its heritage. And once those people begin to rise, the entire United States of America is destroyed. You don't come back from that. And so white supremacy became a strategy exported from Europe to North America, to all around the world, and implemented in the Black land as a system that constantly ensures that this part of the world and the people that it is attributed to are constantly held in a repressed state, a suppressed state for all time. Contrast this with the ritual that was done for the re-emergence of the Kempne, the ancient Black African thinking. So what do you think is going to happen? We're at the same place. It's always the same thing. What is the true nature of the universe? Is it good or is it bad? Because the answer to that question is also the answer to the question, what is the true nature of humankind? Which is also an extent or a limited form of the more extended question, what is the true nature of the Creator? Is he good or is he evil? That's what all of this really is all about. In my conviction, the Creator is good. Why? Because I have seen his work in all areas of human experience, the unity of all things, the beauty that emerges from it is transcendental, is beyond description. It's beyond human understanding. It is an absolute good that cannot be qualified. And so, all the machinations that have been structured on this planet to try to paint humankind as monstrously evil with only one outcome, they will all fail. It's all destined to be destroyed. All of it. As far-reaching, as magnificent as it looks, it's all destined for the garbage heap. Don't be scared by this. Don't be scared. Because you have never known what true freedom really is. All you have known is an inversion, an inverted reality. Tell me, what type of freedom can exist in a world where a huge amount of people are in bondage? What type of freedom are we talking about? You have a lot of people who go around the world. They accept the world the way that it is because for them, they're not blacks. They're not black. They're not part of any type of, they're not deeply melanated people. So for them, the world is normal. Because they say to themselves, they say, look, we are the smarter people, so we deserve to be the most successful people of the world. The black Africans are the dumbest people, they're the primitive people, so they deserve to be the bottom of the world. What's wrong with that? It's normal. If they were smart, they will also be where we are. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, that is absolute nonsense. There is nothing smart about these earth-based strategies. You can't get off the rock. People don't understand that it is when from the perspective of the earth-based strategies, when they look into the universe, everything they see is tainted and laced with the background of that earth-based strategy thinking. Every aspect. When you look at the nearest star, it's 4.2 light years away. There is no penis-shaped object that will get you there in any sensible lifetime. None. See? That's the nearest star. The nearest, the Andromeda galaxy is 2 million light years away. That's just, the human mind cannot even contemplate that. And so what that means is that earth-based strategies are effectively quarantined from the sky. That's what it means. But not just there. There's another quarantine because there is the general consensus that, based on measurements in science, that the 95% of the universe is unknown. It's not 95% of the universe that's unknown. It's 95% of what human experience is supposed to be that is unknown. And you would think that I perceive myself as a totality, as a sense of how can 95%, that's how much is not known of what human experience really is. Because you think that you can perceive a universe that is out there. It's not true. The only perception you have is the one that you are privy to, your internal state of awareness. Objective reality is the aspects of the internal state of awareness that we can all agree upon. It is very limited, it is very sparse. And a lot is lost in that transformation. That is the nature of the 95%. What is it really? They are connections. The way everything is connected together. That's what's missing. And it is also a limitation of all earth-based strategic thinking. All earth-based narratives. You can't cross over. So you can't understand what these things are from the point of view of the thinking that has got it this far. You can't cross over. Why? Because the earth-based, that is the nature of their limitation. That's why they say that that's why we say that they are limited. I mean, you cannot compare the nature of earth to sky or the nature of earth to sun. It's an apparent illusion. It's an illusion. The sun appears to be very small in the sky. It is an illusion. An illusion created from our vantage point, by our vantage point on earth. You see, because the sun is about 330,000 times more massive than this. The sun is about 330 times more massive than the earth. You know? It's 150 million kilometers away, so it appears like the same size of the moon in the sky. But these two things have no, they have no real comparison, and so is the thinking. Earth-based strategies, they seem so powerful because they have control over the earth. And what is the earth? The earth is your physical body, the limitation of your physical body that is always in one place at one time. And so the power that earth-based strategies wield is the power over earth-based life. And so the weapon for wielding that power is the threat or the fear or death itself. And so that forces the human mind into a concentrated nucleus, driven by that fear. That's really what it is. Meanwhile, the solar-based strategy, the strategy, or the sky-based strategy, they're unlimited. They just go on and on. They connect the entire universe because the sun is connected to another cluster that is also connected to the local black hole at the center of the galaxy. They're all connected, they're all united, and all the galaxies are united in ways that we cannot even begin to understand. Such that the only realization is that the entire universe is a connected whole. The connected whole is not limited by the velocity or the speed of light. That's really what it is. And so, forget people. You look at the black nation that is trapped in North America and everything that has been done to it. These are people who have gone crazy because the amount of trauma that those people have had to absorb for hundreds and hundreds of years. I am surprised that there are sane people amongst them. if not that they embody something that is beyond belief in terms of the black consciousness itself, the nature of the six, they would have lost them, they would have been destroyed completely because they cannot survive that. The cruel is like taking something and projecting fire on it. For that object not to burn, there has to be aspects of it that are fire resistant. That's exactly what it is. These are people that have been placed right there strategically in the heart of this madness so that they can absorb all the madness. Because they can attenuate it over time. That's the power of black consciousness. They will attenuate it. Given a few generations, it will dissipate to nothing. By the time this is happening, all the cruelty must have left them, because check out who are the people who are fighting for the good things in the world today. Anti-slavery, anti-human trafficking, anti-genocide, it's the same, it's the Europeans. So what has happened is, over time, as they have become wealthier, as they have become more whatever, they have saturated themselves. They have exhausted the depths, the cruelty, the inhumanity that was conferred upon them by the environment where they were nurtured. They have shed all of it and shed it into black consciousness, where it will become attenuated till it's nothing. As far as I'm concerned, that is the greatest act of love that this world has ever witnessed. That I began to conjecture that it is not a mistake. It is the strategy that the Creator has used for the salvation of all mankind, all humankind, both melanated and non-melanated. Because it is easy to just say, okay, only the melanated people, and that's it, and everybody else dead. But there's goodness in non-melanated people. There is goodness in melanated people. There is wickedness in melanated people, and there's wickedness in non-melanated people. This is not what matters. What matters is the response to truth. And that is what the emergence, the re-emergence of the Kempnu, that is what they're counting on. That is what they have built their strategy on. And that is why they targeted this point in time in our history, human history, for their re-emergence. And they will be born as children all over the world. Each child equipped with a particular way of thinking about the world. And that's how they forge a new reality. Over time, you just see that most of the horrendous type of beingness, thinking, that has led to the world, that has, over the last 500 years, it will begin to be shed from all sorts of people. Also, look, in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, global movement, was the largest demonstration in human history. You think it's a coincidence? It sent shock and fear all across the world, because this is something that the world has never seen in its current iteration of recorded history. It has never seen that. This is an awakening. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does everything begin to make sense now? Is everything falling into place now in your head? Now you can be a part of this change and survive, or you can be opposite this change and you will be destroyed completely. Destroyed beyond recognition. Pulverized is the word. Because you have pockets of this kind of thinking that will put up resistance, because they want to hold on to that cruel power that comes from being able to dominate others in the most wretched of ways. Because they believe that is the only way that human beings can exist, human beings can be. And so they set about, let me tell you what they do. They set about creating they set about creating the conditions for the continued domination of this kind of thinking. And that's why they constantly, they constantly create something like inflation, economic inflation, where your money is worth less just with time, so as to cause you to strive. The world is becoming more and more financially difficult. Poverty is increasing. Forget all the things you see and the flashy gadgets and the flashy phones. No, those things are increasingly being bought on credit, meaning that they finish spending what they have saved in the past. They have spent all that they have earned today, and they have spent years into the future. That's enslavement. It's bondage. Because the money means nothing. Money is just paper with pictures on it. It's a psychic event. Money is somebody's imposition of will on a piece of paper. And then you buy into that construct and you become bonded to that construct. It becomes a part of your reality. So it's really nothing if you look at it for what it really is. It's just bondage. And why do they do this? They do this because they have to continually tap into that aspect of your being that is primitive, that is fearful, that they need to keep you on that level so that survival becomes the only thing that you can do. Because when people are trying to survive, they don't think beyond, they don't look for solutions or insights into the higher mysteries. They're kept on a survival where they can continue to live in ignorance and do a lot of evil because of that. It's not happening by accident. It happens deliberately. These are strategies that were employed in the black nation that is trapped in North America. They kept them on a survival level so that they do not rise up against them someday, because they were afraid of them. Because even though the founding fathers of North America declared that all men were free, they didn't refer to those black people. For them, they were not considered human beings. And even when they began to look at them as human beings, the very thought that the people who they have treated like this now becomes equal to them, they became afraid. They'll kill them in the night. And that has been an ongoing fear that has led to the global promulgation of this anti-black racism as a global concerted effort across the world that has touched the life of every black man, woman, and child, whether they are aware of it or not. Now, black people have had different strategies to deal with this. Some people have just said, you know what, we just have to align with whatever these people want so we can get what we want. And for that, they've been rewarded extensively. Some other people have said, all manner of resistances have occurred, and, with varying types of outcomes. But a lot of people, a lot of black civilization, black consciousness has basically lost hope. Now, it doesn't matter whether they have hope or they lose hope. It doesn't matter. Because everything is like a clock. When the time comes, when the moment is exactly right, that which was broken will begin to be what? Amended. That's nature. That's natural law. In this case, it is a law that has been programmed thousands of years ago, forgotten and passed into legend, fairy tales, fables, folklore. But that this treatment of black civilization and black consciousness was not a random event. It was actually orchestrated divinely by the creator of this entire universe. I'm not getting religious on y'all. I'm not really. I don't do religion. Everything I do is based on what? Physics. The physics of what? Physical reality, which we study physics, classical physics, quantum physics and all that. And the physics of human consciousness. Because it is the marriage of the two that is the description of reality. So you see, at the end of the day, the cruelty, the wickedness, everything has a purpose. Everything has been engineered for a reason. it's not, what I'm trying to say is that it is not important whether we can see the reason or not. Now, how is it going to play out into the future? Oh, that's a very interesting conversation, requiring an entire podcast on its own. This is already 2 hours and a bit long. Because the future is where it all comes together. It's the most interesting aspect of this. That's why I think I'm going to reserve it for a future podcast, maybe like a part 2 or something. Because that involves the rectification of the world, the redemption of the entire world, how blackness is reborn into the world. Because remember, blackness is just a phenomenon, like heat or like electromagnetism. But you can see that once human beings discovered electromagnetism and how to apply it as a tool, it transformed the entire world. It's the same thing. You understand the nature of blackness as a phenomenon. Then you see the applications of blackness and the entire world becomes changed. The entire physics, chemistry, biology, everything just is transformed. It's a different type of understanding, but it's a root understanding. Just like the phenomena that you could objectify reality is the root understanding behind science and technology. The fact that that there is more to reality than the objectification of reality becomes another root understanding that also transforms the world. That's how it is. That's really how it is. To all the naysayers, the ones who talk about personal response, because I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and they talk about, oh, black people don't take personal responsibility. They're always trying to play the victims, blah, 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 blah. I often ask them, how much personal responsibility is involved in taking another man as a slave so that the man can work for free for centuries, and then you can profit for that? And then when you are done, you dispose the man. When that man is working his butt off, working his hands to the bone, sometimes working to death, where is your personal responsibility there? A lot of people talk about, oh, we're immigrants, we immigrated to the United States, we came here, we worked hard and everything. Yeah? You obviously don't know the history of that United States. You don't know the sacrifices that made it possible for you to come and reap benefits of things you didn't work for. You think you worked hard. Do you realize that some people built that nation from ground with their bare hands? They built it for hundreds of years for no wage, none whatsoever. And when they dared to speak up, they were brutalized and killed, and blood spilled in their millions. People hanged and lynched in their thousands, so that you can enjoy these statements that you are making. But of course, you cannot perceive that because you don't want to perceive that. You have bought into the lies that is white supremacy and anti-black racism because it is convenient for you. But remember, if you tolerate injustice to some group of people because it is not you, someday they will come for you. That's the nature of human psychology. Because the people who promulgate this injustice, they don't care whether you're white, black, they don't care. They're just looking for advantage at any cost. And someday you will begin to look like a nice target, and then you would expect the whole world to stand still for you. There will be nothing left, nobody left to stand for you. You'll be consumed. And that's exactly what's going on today. The entire world was happy to feed off. You have people who believe that they're great because they're intelligent and smart. They did not realize the things that have been done in their name. They did not realize that the fact that they've had stable currencies, stable economies, stable politics, it is because the chaos that is the essential nature of their being has been exported to another group of people that don't even know what's going on there. The violence of their nature, the cruelty that is embodied in them because of the environment that they grew up in, has been exported to a group of people who don't even have a clue what's going on. They just know that they're born into a what? Into hell. They live all their lives navigating hell and they die in hell. With none the wiser, no idea. Do you have any idea what this kind of thing is? That nation that was trapped in North America, do you realize what was done to them? How they were constantly, how war was constantly waged against them at every turn. How the cruelty of an entire group of people was transferred into these people. How they were driven insane with grief and hopelessness. Do you not realize what is transmitted? Most people don't realize that the descendants of all those, because the famous argument you hear is that, oh, these were done long ago by ancestors, they were not us. Why should we take responsibility? You are a bloody fool. Because I don't know if you deliberately choose to be dumb or it is convenient for you to be dumb. I'm not quite sure what it is per se. But if you believe that somehow you are distanced or dissociated from those activities, you just, I don't even know what to describe you as. The blood that runs in your veins is the blood of the people who did this. You are them. Even if you don't want to be. It is not a choice that have been. It's like being born into a particular family. Do you choose to be born into that family? You are born into the family, then you try to make the best of it. And there's a reason for that. There's also a wisdom in that kind of thinking. That you can rise above your natural constraints. Instead of saying, oh no, this has nothing to do with me, those people were whatever, you can decide to do the opposite. We have inherited this, we have nothing to do with it. But in acknowledgement of what we have inherited, we will make the world right. We will act. Just like actions were taken to unbalance the entire world and to bring in this evil, we will also act to balance it and to bring in good. It has now become a responsibility, not one that can be shirked. That is the remediation. But instead, you find a lot of people who say, oh no, how can I come and take responsibility for something that my ancestors did? Yeah? But you can take responsibility, you enjoy the peace, the stability, the currency, the economy that was created by all these activities. You don't run away from it, you enjoy it. But you're not willing to absorb the cost of that. Every group of human beings that atrocities have been committed to, now that the world has finally understood what the difference between right and wrong, until the entire world compensates blackness, then it cannot move forward. Move forward to where? How? To build a lie, another lie on top of a lie? When the Japanese were interned during the Second World War, when Japanese Americans were interned because of America's war with Japan, they were all paid compensation. After the war. Most people who have been dealt so badly, once it is recognized, compensation is paid. It's not because the money is going to bring back what was lost. It's a token of saying that we are sorry, so that people can heal and move on. The only people that this has never been done to on any scale whatsoever are black people all across the world. And that's why I say that the entire world owes black people a debt that can never be paid. In time, this will become understood. People are often misdirected or misinformed of the fact that they think that their guns and their weapons and their missiles and their strategic missiles and all these stupid things, their bio-warfare and all these things, that these things are going to become saving graces. You do not understand. You can build a jail cell and throw a man or a woman inside. But a time can come when you begin to really ask yourself, who exactly is in jail? The jailer or the jailed? It just requires a change of context or circumstances. And the question becomes what? It becomes a very interesting question. The entire world does not see how the black peoples of the world can become free of the yoke that has been placed on them. Some people decide to even ignore the fact that there is a yoke. Some people don't recognize. I find what I do is I question people. I ask them from time to time, what do you think about this? Most people don't even recognize that they're carrying a yoke. Somehow they've accepted the world as it is. Well, it's a good thing that the acceptance or non-acceptance of the world is not a key criteria for how the world eventually turns out. Because whether by acceptance or non-acceptance, the world reverts to what it naturally is. Truth is like physical law. See, there's a lot of certainty placed in physical law once it is established and deduced. It allows the certainty in the application of a strategy. For instance, you want to fly a jetliner at 30,000 feet. You know that once you know the right processes and you know the right moves, the plane won't fall from the sky. You just know that. That's what gives people the confidence to board these machines. It's the same thing. Physical, the laws that govern human consciousness are also like that. Why should they be any different? Now, as time goes on, you would see, people talk about the emergence of Donald Trump as representing, oh, this is such a bad time in history. Nothing could be further from the truth. Donald Trump was literally the emergence of the truth. You see, because I don't particularly care for politicians, because there are no good ones amongst them. The dynamic that allows a politician to emerge as a front runner ensures that he must be bought and paid for completely. He must be a liar. He will never come to do anything good. And so the political system cannot produce any good person. Doesn't matter whether you operate in the politics, whatever it is you operate in the politics. That's what guarantees that the world continues to get worse and worse and worse. You see? If you don't think that the world is getting worse, it's because of your vantage point. Because what an entire 21st century modern civilization does, it exports its problems and hides them away. So if you go to a civilization or a country, you need to know how many of its citizens are locked up in prison cells if you want to have a measure of how well that civilization is doing. You need to check how many of its citizens have been so crazy that the necessity has been reached that you must lock these people away from society. That's really a measure of it. You want to know the measure of any economic system? How many countries is it impoverishing so that it can live the way that it does? How many millions of people will never have meaning in their lives so that this country can live the way that it does? These are the measures of human consciousness, not what you tell yourself or the stories or the fables or the tricks that you write or the lies that you tell. These things are meaningless. Because in the science and the physics of human consciousness, those things don't matter. You know the truth, and that's all that matters. That's really what it is. So this is very important in the sense that you have a lot of people who do not believe that, or who still argue the fact that black consciousness civilization was destroyed. It was literally attacked and destroyed because the wish is that it will be enslaved forever. It will remain entombed forever, but that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. The same laws of physics, the same physical laws or laws of the universe that ensure that light from the sun travels all the way to the earth, is the same laws, the physical laws built into the very heart of reality, of nature. that will ensure that resurrection takes place. It's physics. It is inevitable. It is the inevitability of the laws of human consciousness, right? That is what is supposed to moderate human behavior. But somewhere along this line, everybody forgot about this law, and these laws were now replaced by religious dogma. So when people cannot see the causal structure that informs the science and the physics of human consciousness, then they believe that nothing matters. Anything, you can do whatever you like, everything goes. Because they cannot see the causal structure anymore because it's been hidden. But yet the causal structure is there, it never went anywhere. There's really nothing you can do about it. It's always there. And it's like a machine that just works out the way that it is instructed to. That's really what it is. Tell me, what guns or what weapons, what missiles are you going to use to fight this structure? You can't even see it. Most of human consciousness, most of human experience in the last few thousand years, you don't even believe that it exists. So who are you going to fight exactly? It's a futile, fruitless effort. Are you going to shoot the sky? Are you going to shoot the air? Are you going to shoot the water? Are you going to shoot the wind? These are meaningless concepts. A religion was supposed to mediate human or regulate human behavior, but it cannot do that because it is a product of the same limited thinking. And that's why you look at Christianity. Christianity actually is a solar. It is the rising and setting of the solar mind. That's really what it is. And the reason why people originally studied it in ancient black Kemetian consciousness is because of what it means. Because remember, we're talking about the physics of human consciousness. The physics of human consciousness is the behavior, the intrinsic behavior of everything in existence, of which the sun is one powerful entity that's very close to us in existence. So they studied all these things to understand how all of this informs the nature of I. That in modern 21st century thinking, all these things are tossed out because the karmic structure, the causal structure for all these things are unknown, and they are relegated to the vestiges of pseudoscience and metaphysics and religion. That it is within the science of human consciousness that we make sense of the world. The objective nature of reality, which we're so hungry after, has no meaning if you're not alive and present to observe that objective universe. When we fully understand it, do you have any idea? You wouldn't kill, death will disappear from the world. Death, you look at death and you say, oh, all life must die. It's not true. This type of life must die, but not all life must die. Death is the corruption that is inherent within that life because of the thinking behind it. That when the hard physicality of the universe is transformed by the change in awareness from the inside, then there's nothing for death to hold on to. There's no hard physicality anymore. And that's really what it is.